Typically when I go around and do talks, I'm talking about one of our collections. Most often it's the Eastern Illustrating and Publishing Company collection, and that was the collection that brought me to the museum and this whole world. And we'll talk about them briefly tonight. But this was a chance to go through and share many of our collections that we have, focusing on Blue Hill as much as possible. And a great number of our collections do have Blue Hill images in them. And there are some interesting ones, and I've learned a lot just putting this together. So first, a little PR about the museum. How many people have been to the Penobscot Marine Museum? All right. And how many people have been there this year? Oh, even better. We're down in Searsport. My advanced key is not working. I guess I can just click the pad. Never mind. Well, first of all, for those of you who have not been to the Penobscot Marine Museum, here it is as it looked when it first opened in 1936. At the time, well, it is still the oldest maritime museum in the state. Not the biggest, but it is the oldest. And when we first opened, it was just this building, which had been the Searsport Town Hall and jail. This is now our fisheries exhibit, this whole building. And the museum has grown to be a whole campus. We have 13 buildings that include several historic sea captains' homes. And to the left of this building is a big modern library that was built in the 1990s. And that's where most of our collections are housed, and that's where the photography archives live. This year, one of our board members and probably our biggest cheerleader, Wayne Hamilton, has donated one of his Mustangs from his collection that he is auctioning. We are auctioning it off through a sweepstakes to benefit the museum. So check out our website if this interests you. I hope it does. It's an awesome car. And this year we have a couple new exhibits. We were open the past 2 years, but it was limited. This year we're back to being fully open. We had 2 new exhibits, photography exhibits that we created. This is one of them. If you're not familiar with Kosti Ruohomaa, he was probably Maine's most famous and iconic photographer. Born in Rockland, he ended up working for a photo agency in New York City called Black Star and working for all the big magazines of the time. And he really brought Maine to the rest of the world and showed people around the United States and the world what it was like to live in Maine, because that was his passion. And as he became more established, he got to choose his own assignments, and they were typically Maine-based assignments. So we have an exhibit up that showcases his Maine-based assignments. It was supposed to go up during Maine's bicentennial, but we had to kick it down the road. So I do encourage you to come see that. We also have a new exhibit of photographs that were collected by Captain Bill Abbott. Captain Abbott, or Captain Bill, was a Penobscot Bay pilot, meaning he would go out to the big tankers and other giant ships that came from foreign waters and guide them through Penobscot Bay and up the Penobscot River. Fascinating life that he led. He was one of these people that started the official association of the Penn Bay pilots that still exists today. And before that, it was a bit of a free-for-all. Whatever boat got out to, a foreign vessel got the job, which created some problems here and there. So it's a good thing that they came along. And we also have an art exhibit up, curated by Carl Little, who was a fairly well-known Maine art critic and appreciateur. And it's paintings from our collections of Penobscot Bay, but also of contemporary artists who paint Penobscot Bay. And it's a beautiful exhibit and worth seeing. And last but not least, in terms of promotion, if you go to the event on Saturday here, the festival, you will find our booth, and you can even dress up in period clothes and have your picture taken in front of this creative backdrop. I won't be there, unfortunately, but our education director and I think one of our interns will be. It sounds like a great festival. So as I mentioned, our archive has more than 500,000 photographic images that are broken up into by different collections. We have 130,000 of these images online, and we're adding more all the time. Pretty much everything that I'm going to show you tonight, you could go home and find online. We use a software called Past Perfect, or as we like to say, Past Imperfect. It's a little tricky to navigate, very specific, but you can find what you're looking for most of the time. And if not, you're more than welcome to call me or email me and just tell me what you're looking for, and I'll send links that will bring it up. And we offer prints, reproduction prints, fine art prints. If you're an author or a movie maker and you need historic images, don't forget about us. So the first collection we'll take a look at is a guy named Carroll Thayer Berry. Most people know Carroll as a printmaker. He made woodblock prints, and you can see him turning on his press that would emboss a print. What people don't really know is that he was also a passionate photographer and an avid member of the Knox County Camera Club. He lived down in Rockport, and he was one of the founding members of the Mid-Coast Artists, which has now become Center for Maine Contemporary Art, CMCA, which is now based in Rockland. But here we see downtown Rockport, where CMCA used to be located. You can probably tell which vintage we're looking at here. Great station wagon. And I mentioned Kosti Ruohomaa. Kosti Ruohomaa was a contemporary of Carroll Thayer Berry, and he and another photographer named Jim Moore did a book together called Portrait of the Maine Coast. And here we see Carroll Thayer Berry photographing Kosti, while Kosti is photographing Carroll. So we have the photo that Carroll took. I still have not yet found the photo that Kosti took, but I'm looking forward to that. So the Berry collection is quite big, but he did come to Blue Hill in the 1956 to be exact, and most likely on one of the windjammers. He spent a lot of time going out on the windjammers. So we know that he came in October of 1956, and this was the work that he landed on. I'm hoping someone in the audience can tell me where exactly this is. Anyone recognize it? We'll see it a little closer here.
That's East Blue Hill. That's not Blue Hill.
East Blue Hill.
That's East Blue Hill, yeah. That's East Blue Hill too.
So I think all the photos that he took are probably East Blue Hill.
Yes.
And one thing that I found in putting this talk together is that in terms of maritime photos, they tend to be in East Blue Hill rather than Blue Hill. A couple of boat building shops over there, and so you might notice that this photo is square. He used a medium format camera, either a Hasselblad or a Rolleiflex, which would be the type that he'd be looking down into, and their images are square. It's a very different way of composing the world, and very popular in the 1950s especially. This looks like a boatyard, and probably is in East Blue Hill. We know that the boats there on the waves are the power boat, the Kingfisher, and a sailboat called the Lively Lady 2. Does anyone know which boatyard this might be? Is there only one over there, or is there a couple?
Yeah, it's Weber's Cove.
Weber's Cove.
Okay, Weber Cove.
That was built much later. It's a fake one.
He made many photographs during his excursions on the windjammers, and they're amazing, and one of the reasons that we're so thrilled with the collection. He also really tried hard at his landscape photography, which was not quite as strong, but his images were used for inspiration for his woodblock prints. And then we know the CF Westcott iron forging. This won't be the only time you'll see this building tonight, but I found it pretty neat to see it in the 50s here. He would have still been alive, Charles, at this point. So we'll look at two collections here, the Atlantic Fisherman and the National Fisherman. Both of these are journals about fishing, and they both spawned from the Maine coast fishermen, which preceded them. And here we can see covers, Atlantic Fisherman on the left, that was in publication from the 1920s until 1950, and then the National Fisherman picked up and went from 1950 and is still published today. We initially received most of the archives of the Atlantic Fisherman from one of its publishers. And then National Fisherman gave us all of their print photography from all the years up till they went digital. And that was an archive of almost 40,000 photographs that are now all digitized and online. And as the title of the journal says, it goes well beyond Maine. It covers all of the United States. This was a photo that ended up in the Atlantic Fisherman Collection, and this is a 64-foot lobster smack in Lynn that was built at Weber's Cove Boatyard. And it was one of the few Weber Cove constructions that was that year that was built for a Perry, I can't pronounce his last name, but Duryea, for his Montauk, New York lobster buying business. So I thought it was kind of neat that someone would come all the way up to Blue Hill to have a boat made, but I've learned since then that it's kind of typical that people would come up to Maine to have especially lobster and other fishing boats made for them.
Do you know approximately the date on that?
I want to say it's in the 40s, and I don't have it on my notes, though I do think we know what it is, which is not helpful at the moment, but one of the reasons you can email me later. Now, these next group of photos, next few photos are from the National Fisherman, so they're a little bit more modern. And this is in Peters Point Cove in Blue Hill. And we have a marine biologist named Malcolm Richards, who is putting panels down while Ray Prosser stands ready to lend a hand. These guys were biologists and they were doing a study there. Just kind of neat. This is in 1977. And National Fisherman would have these little stories like this. They did as much about biology and the science of it as about fishing itself. So this is in Blue Hill Marine. Is that different than Weber Cove, but in Blue Hill proper? Okay. So this is a fiberglass interior of a hull for a power boat, and with the goal of being roomy. And the word in quotes was roominess. Somehow they must have used that in the magazine. Our archive is filled with boat photographs and construction, more modern than old, but plenty of old stuff as well. Here's another one. This is at the Weber's Cove boatyard, and it's a lobster boat for Nick Sterling of Crisfield, Maryland, 1976. And this person is Mark Richmond, and who is using trays to raise oysters in the salt pond here in 1976. I take it he's not still around raising oysters? Maybe he was before his time. Seems everyone is raising oysters now, which is a good thing. And now this is not Blue Hill, but I thought I'd just include a couple other photos just to give you a sense of what might be in these collections. This is from the Atlantic Fisherman Collection, and it's the AEC McClune, which is a lobster smack being lengthened. And if you ever wondered how they lengthen a boat, they cut it in half, separate it, and then build in a new middle. So you can see the space between the two halves there. Isn't that amazing?
They did that a lot.
They did it a lot, yeah. Here's a photo from National Fisherman, and an amazing photograph, but looking down as they're pulling in a seine net of herring in the Gulf of Maine. We wonder why there's not many herring left, but we were pretty efficient at catching them. And then there's other photos like this that are scary and you can't look away kind of image. This is down in Rockland, and the fisherman survived it, but his boat did not. Have anyone here that knows Maynard Bray? Thought there'd be a couple. Maynard Bray lives down in Brooklyn, and he is the technical editor of Wooden Boat magazine. He grew up in Rockland, and then ended up down at Mystic Seaport as a curator for a number of years before coming back to Maine and setting up shop down in Brooklyn and working for Wooden Boat magazine. And a few years back, he donated his collection to us, which is such an amazing opportunity, because when you're at a museum and you get a collection in and the photographer's been dead for 20 years, you know, you're trying to figure everyone out. We have the person who took these photos and remembers and is going through each one and telling us everything that we need to know about them, what makes them significant, why he took them. And here we see a young Maynard behind the wheel of one of his sailboats. He's pushing 90 now, so he's not a spring chicken anymore. But he, in 1997, well, actually before that, this is when he was a kid, and he and his friend Don Merchant, this was their playground down at Snow's Marine in Rockland, and they would spend all their time down there. And you can see their shadows. They had run of the place. They were allowed to collect scraps and make small boats and rafts themselves. They just had a kid's dream of a childhood there. And they took photos, and there's photos that document what they did. Don just died last year, sadly. And his collection is also at the museum, though his collection was only these childhood years when he was 14 to 16 and they were playing down there. Shot with like his dad's camera. Another classic photo also at Snow's Marine. And some of the guys up against the lobster boat. Now we're in Blue Hill, and this is Maynard's wife, Anne, and she's taking a peek inside of a cat boat called the Molly B, which they ended up buying in 1997. And so they were here in Blue Hill to look at it, and it was owned by Paul and Molly Birdsall at the time. There's Anne taking a peek inside. Here she is taking a peek outside from the inside. And we're about 3/4 of the way through Maynard's collection, but those were the two that were Blue Hill ones for sure. But this is the Molly B, not in Blue Hill, probably in there. There you go, Center Harbor. This, oh, I'm sorry, there's one more from, this is a Fred Cousins skiff that was designed by Cousins and built by Cousins. This photo was also taken in 1997, probably at the same time that he was looking at the Molly B. And these were the type of photos that Maynard liked to take. There's another 5 or 6 that show all these different joints and the way the planks are put together and the various details that go into making any kind of boat. This will just be a fun little jaunt. Harriet Hichborn. Has anyone eaten at the Hichborn in Stockton? It's kind of a fancy restaurant. It's in Harriet Hichborn's house, which is this. Her father was a guy named Jonathan Hichborn, and he was a shipbuilder in Stockton Springs. That's him standing in front of his house. She was a young woman who learned photography, which was unusual for that time period. And she mostly photographed Stockton, life around Stockton and the waterfront, a lot of maritime stuff, and Searsport. But apparently she came to Blue Hill and made photographs in a portrait studio.
Good question. In terms of the collections that you have of photography, when was the transition from glass plate to film? So in other words, if you have a photograph from 1900, is that going to be glass plate?
Most likely. There was some early acetate film that was coming out then. And in the teens and 20s, there was an overlap, so it depended on what kind of camera you had, but there was some flexible film at the time. People used glass plate negatives, and these are dry plates, not the same as the Civil War era, which was wet plate. These were dry plates, were used up until the 30s. And the Eastern Illustrating Company that made the postcards used them much longer than, you know, I think the technology had already changed, but their personal technology, their cameras, their postcard printing machines were all set up for glass plates. So they continued to use them, sort of the way people hung onto their film cameras while all the digital stuff was coming out. So they couldn't resist. And then some of us still hold on to them. So anyway, these are just some amazing portraits shot in Blue Hill at a portrait studio. We don't know who any of these people are. Does anyone recognize their great grandmother? I love the little thing above her head, which would have been cropped out when the print was made, but that allowed light to come through and soften as it hit her face.
Oh my God.
So this is kind of an aside in her collection, and if you were to explore it, you would find mostly life around Stockton Springs. A lot of steamboat photos, a lot of Stockton Harbor when it was quite industrial. So we have several collections from historical societies of glass plate negatives because they typically don't have a place to store them at the right temperature and humidity, and they don't typically have a staff that can digitize them and do all that it needs to happen to make them useful. So the Sedgwick Brooklin Historical Society and the Deer Isle Stonington Historical Society both donated their glass plate collections to the museum. And we give them the high-res digital files, and they're completely happy with that. And the Sedgwick Brooklyn had some Blue Hill photos in it. This is the lighthouse on Green Island, I believe. We know that it was built in 1856. This photo was probably taken more like 1905 or thereabouts. And their collection of glass plate negatives is a hodgepodge. It's not different families that made some photographs here and there. And then, so there are some real gems and then a lot of anonymous people and places. But this would have been the original bridge over Blue Hill Falls. You can see there's some people on it. Another photo that's a little bit closer. I believe the new bridge went in 1926. So this could be any time in the between 1900 and 1915, I would say. And then this is a group of, looks like all young men. I have some women in the corner at a cemetery here in Blue Hill. But this was one of the real gems that was in that collection. And it's one that I had seen reproductions of here and there. But to actually have the original negative, it's amazing. And I mean, just how primitive the fair was at this point in time, but it just looks awesome.
What year do you think that is?
I would say 1895 or 1900 maybe. And this is like an example when you talk about resolution, when you have the negative of an image like this, there's the negatives are large. This one is a 4x5, so it's 4 inches by 5 inches. When you think of resolution, like a 35mm negative is about the size of a postage stamp. And how many postage stamps could you put on a 4x5 negative? That's how much more information is in a large format negative. And then you take a 5x7 or even an 8x10, you can just keep zooming in, and if they focused it right, you will, you know, looking in windows, reading signs, uncovering amazing details. I would like to tell you about uncovering details. And this was also in that collection, and our cataloger had, I believe this is Blue Hill in the description, and I think that it is. I'm not sure where it was taken. Maybe someone here can figure that out.
Probably from the golf course.
From the golf course?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a nice view of the town and the mountain.
It could be on what they call Spoon Island, the one that.
On the left.
Well,
Oh, I see.
There's a little island he's standing on.
He would be standing on the island, possibly.
There's a ledge over there.
I like to do then and now photos. It sounds like this would be a
Yeah.
harder one to
It'd be a good
recreate.
one.
Yeah.
Now, I'm only going to show a couple of the Deer Isle Stonington collection to whet your appetite. They did not have any that were identified as Blue Hill, but some being from the same part of, you know, extension of the peninsula, I would say that you would be interested. This is, anyone know what's going on here?
Baptism.
A baptism, yes. This is a series of 3 photos where people are getting dunked in cold water. So there was the historian on Isle of Ho did a write-up recently about this photograph and this vessel. It was the Yankee Notion, and it's a scow. And it was built on Swan's Island from scraps by Captain William Cottrell in 1896. And he lived on this boat with his dog. And he traveled around this area and did cobbling work. So he would pull up into your harbor, and if you had shoes that needed to be repaired, you'd bring them down there. But it's amazing.
Yes.
I think he was crippled. I think he was in a wheelchair or didn't get around.
It was a cripple. Yes, I believe you're right. Yes, he was lame and used crutches to get aboard.
Yeah.
And his only shipmate was his small yellow dog Snips. There's a story right there that somebody needs to write. And then this is near MDI. But a Zeppelin, and a warship, and a giant steam yacht,
That's the short one.
and all these people watching it like it's TV because they didn't have TV yet. And they went out and looked at things back then. They weren't home at Zoom watching slideshow presentations. And this is a timely image. It's a building that's out on Widow's Island in Penobscot Bay. And it was built by the US Navy to house people who might have been exposed to yellow fever. And they had to quarantine there. That was the whole idea. So everyone was complaining during the pandemic about quarantining, but you didn't have to go back that far in history to when you had to quarantine before. And it was never actually used as that. By the time it got built, that epidemic had subsided. And then it ended up being used as a retreat for an insane asylum. And they would bring residents out there in the summer for a couple of weeks at a time and help to rehab them. And I was very curious about this building, and I learned it was most likely an ice house. And that's where they would keep all their food and collect ice and store it in there from whatever pond might have been on the island. The island is now in private hands.
Is the building still there?
What's that?
Is the building still there?
I don't know that. It seems like quite the giant schoolhouse.
It's gone.
It's gone.
Gone a long time ago. They sold the guy who lives on Bard Islands went over there with a raft and got a lot of bricks to make his fireplace during the depression.
That's Maine
That's right at
resourcefulness.
the eastern end of the Fox Island thoroughfare.
Okay. Here we have an icebreaker going through off of Stonington.
Wow.
And when that needed help, then this is what they would resort to. Dynamiting the ice.
Yeah.
But when you think about it, places that were either on islands or on peninsulas, if the boats couldn't get to it with supplies, then the people were in trouble. So it was important to keep channels open. These are all the friendship sloops in the winter, used for lobstering at this time, not for pleasure. The next collection we'll look at is that of Everett Red Boudoir. He was from Bremen, Long Island. Well, he was actually from Nova Scotia, but he ended up in Bremen, Long Island in the early 1950s and was a photojournalist. He wrote his own stories and took his own photos. This is he on the left in the plaid. He was known to use a speed Graflex, and we actually have that camera at the museum, and supposedly left a trail of flash bulbs wherever he went. And he used this speed Graflex, which is like the old news cameras that you would hold up in front of your face, and you're not actually looking through the lens, you're looking through a finder in the corner. And but he used it all the way up until the early 1990s, shooting 4x5 sheet film.
That was a replica of the America. that they built
Behind him,
For the shape.
he documented that boat inside and out.
Yeah.
And he hounded all the boatyards in the mid-coast. And if there was a boat launch, supposedly he did not miss it. And he was quite a character. We ended up getting his collection from his son, who's also a character, for, I forget how many thousands of dollars it was, but it was like $30,000, which is what he wanted to buy this hot rod car that he had his eye on. And this collection is almost 30,000 images, and is almost all online. So this is a downeaster model from the John Cousins East Blue Hill Boat Works that was finished by a guy named Bruce Cunningham at Penobscot Yard in Round Pond. And this is the new owner of this boat. His name is Sonny Lehman, Thurlow Sonny Lehman, and he was from the Fishermen's Cooperative out of South Bristol. The name of this boat is the Island Queen, to be used for ground fishing. Now this is not Blue Hill, but it has a Blue Hill connection. This is the Lois M. Candage, and she was one of the windjammers, and that's what you might be familiar with her in somewhat more recent times. She was initially built in 1884 in Gouldsboro and named the Lizzie and Annie, but then rebuilt here in Blue Hill in 1912 and named the Lois M. Candage. And she was a coastal schooner and worked for a number of years until she ended up in Frank Swift's windjammer fleet. And after some time there, she fell upon hard times. This would be around 1959. And she was sold to a person named Ed Myers to serve as a tourist attraction at his restaurant in Daworski. In 1964, leaking badly, which is when this photo was taken, Myers launched a campaign to gather enough plastic bleach bottles to keep her afloat. And so what you're seeing here is her filled with bleach bottles that just keeps her buoyant enough that she can be towed to another port. And she got repaired one more time and then ended up getting laid to rest. She no longer exists, but she did serve as a restaurant for a while. And this is just
The parking lot there.
in the parking lot.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's
wow.
the restaurant. In that same place, she sank and it fell over.
Oh, wow.
She's in the parking lot.
That's her grave, huh? Another photo that really shows. Here we are back in Blue Hill. And this is this is in July of 1975. And it's the Harbor Mast Yachts that had a little sailing event going on. This is, I guess, East Blue Hill as well at the yacht club. And they were giving sailing lessons. And the guy in this little sailboat is Joel York. Is he still around by any chance? No. So I don't know if they were one of the instructors that were teaching sailing, But this is Joel on the left with Teak Wiggins. Red would keep meticulous notes on the envelopes of his negatives. And so translating them was a challenge, but he had the names, he had the places, he had the dates. And that's what you need to do, all your own photo collections and archives. And then a couple more from the Weber Cove Yard. This is the Down East 34. And then here's the outside of the parking lot. Looks like spring. And not Blue Hill, but this is the last one for Red Boudoir. Does anyone recognize this guy?
Is that Cardinal?
Welcome to Fantasy Island. This is in Camden, when he was filming Captain Courageous and signing autographs, apparently. You never know what you'll find in a box of red images. The next collection is that of a woman named Sylvia Wardwell, who lives down in Sargentville. I believe she's still alive. And these aren't photos that she took, but rather collected. And she lived across the street from a woman named Evie Barber, or Evie Kimball, that was her maiden name, who was a postcard photographer. And she would sell her postcards from her front porch in Sargentville. And they were beautiful. Real photo postcards, like printed on silver gelatin paper. And so Sylvia had this collection, and John, I had mentioned a group of images that tell a story. Here we see the Eggemogan Reach without the bridge. And in 1937, they began construction on the bridge. And in this series of images, which she took over probably mostly in 1938, the basic construction of the bridge. So all these barge type ships that you see coming in are filled with the materials. And one of the things that they did, which was somewhat revolutionary at the time, was they prefabbed a lot of the structure itself. And so they weren't supposed to be doing it in the summer when all the yacht people would be out sailing. So they had to do it in the winter and the spring. And so by having stuff put together ahead of time, it made it a little bit easier dealing with the rougher weather. And so they're bringing out the pieces that will form the towers. And you can see people in the foreground that helps to give it scale. People in a little dinghy. Now we see the towers starting to form.
That last one is fun because that is the Stephen Tabor I was trying to do.
So
That boat's still sailing.
coastal schooner, Stephen Tabor, now a windjammer.
Got a load of.
And loaded, yes.
Most of it.
Right and low. Very much obviously a work boat at this time still. But to have this series of images is amazing. I don't know the exact sequence, but I gave it my best shot to put it in a chronological order. It's woman over here posing. No passing through. So before we get to the Eastern Illustrating, and I'll show you a bunch of the Blue Hill scenes, I just wanted to go over some of the other collections that I didn't mention thoroughly, and I'll just be one image piece. Paul Steubing lived down in Stonington area and used to be a curator at Mystic Seaport. And we have his collection of photographs that he took and collected. This is this is the Stephen Tabor on a cradle next to the Weber's Cove boatyard.
My father sold it at Cycles and they owned the boatyard.
Really? Once you get your talk out of the way, we'll have you done. This is a photo from what we call the Jake Gillison collection. Jake Gillison was a collector, antique dealer, postcard dealer. His nickname was Jake the Snake Gillison. He's become kind of a friend, and we've purchased many negatives from him. He knows what we like and he finds them. But we had this one whole collection that he had, and this was included of the Eastern Steamship Line building with the, looks like the steamer Catherine is in front of it.
Well, what's that?
Yeah, where was the Blue Hill?
Was the steamboat.
That's
wharf.
Steamboat Wharf.
In Blue Hill proper?
Yeah, Blue Hill.
And was it serviced not by the Boston boat probably, but by one of the smaller excursion boats?
I got a Belfast.
The Belfast would come here? Oh, okay. So the big boats did. This might be our most famous image in our collection. This is Captain Lincoln Colcord standing on the deck of the state of Maine as it's rounding the Cape of Good Hope. You can see the seas way up behind him, and he has this big smile on his face. He's in his element. You can see the propeller whipping, measuring the wind. And what's most remarkable about this is it was taken by his 15-year-old daughter who was on this trip with him, Joanna Colcord. Her mother hated this photo because he doesn't have his teeth in. But it represents all that we might think about when you think of Maine sea captains and the life that they live. This was Joanna's uncle and Lincoln's brother-in-law, Frederick Ross Switzer. He was a music teacher. He taught down in Connecticut, and his home was in Searsport. And he would spend his summers there and do concerts in Belfast. But he was a novice photographer, but got pretty good. And then we believe he taught his niece, Joanna. But he photographed Joanna, and this is her sitting on Pulpit Rock when she was a young girl. And he photographed her throughout her life. So that's amazing in and of itself. Ruth Montgomery was another sea captain's daughter. She was from Booth Bay, or East Booth Bay, and went on many voyages with her father, and often had these scenes on board ship and in faraway places, mostly in South America in her case, where Joanna was often going over to the Far East. Elmer Montgomery is Maynard Bray's cousin. He passed away some time ago, but Maynard donated his photos to the museum, his negatives, and he only maybe took photographs for 3 years right before World War II. But they are amazing, and he had a really great eye. He was very much enamored with the boats of Rockland waterfront, and that's where he took 90% of his photographs. But you can tell from this one, he knew where to stand, where to point the camera, and he abstracts it, but you can still tell what's going on. It's a beautiful photograph, and it's indicative of his other work. This is one of our funner collections, which is the Maine Sardine Council collection. That's Miss Sardine, yes. Poor guy with a giant can opener. The Maine Sardine Council was part of the Department of Agriculture of the state, and its sole purpose was to promote the sardine industry. And so there's a lot of advertising and fun images like this. But it's where I discovered Kosti Ruohomaa, because he shot 20 rolls of film documenting from weir to can, where he was out at the Dix Island Weir and photographed them emptying it, brought it on the Jacob Pike, the sardine carrier, to Rockland, and then photographed the inside of the canning factory there. Amazing photographs, and that led me to find his biographer, and then that led to writing to Black Star and asking if we could have his photos. So I like this collection very much. This collection, Captain James Perkins, he lived in Popham Beach. This was the life-saving station at Popham Beach, which is now, at least somewhat recently, a B&B, but this building is still there. He was a steamboat captain, and his route was Popham up to Bath. And he has a point of view that most landlocked photographers don't have. I mean, he was able to take photos from the deck of whatever steamboat he was piloting at the time, and they're very interesting photos. And he also documented life in Popham, which was pretty neat. And if you've gone to Popham, it still kind of looks the way it did back then, but really something to take in. Ed Coffin, not a photographer, but a collector of photographs. He lived in Owl's Head, and shortly before he died, he brought his 30 binders full of photos, primarily of the mid-coast and the islands, with a very hard lean on boats, boat building throughout the ages, but mostly old. And we have an exhibit of his work down at the chapel in Brooklyn right now, and it'll be up for another couple of weeks. So if you're driving around and you find yourself down there at the Rockbound Chapel, I'm not exactly sure when it's open, but it's a pretty neat exhibit.
Just a question, are all those at the Rockbound Chapel glass plate negatives?
Well, what we have from Ed Coffin are prints, and he was a collector, and a lot of those images were made from the original form of the glass plate, but we don't have the glass plates themselves in most cases.
So those that are on exhibit, are those copies of his prints?
They would be reproductions of his prints, yes. And his prints were a combination of vintage prints, but also high-end copy negatives that he made himself from the owners of the negative usually. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but the last part confusing. They're really quite dated, so I'm assuming they're all glass plate negatives and not
Dirty meaning
negatives.
spots and other imperfections.
Yeah, but you just said something about negatives, not glass plate negatives, but copies from
Copy negatives.
copies.
So it's pretty typical to photograph a photograph. And essentially that's what we're doing digitally now. Before you could do it digitally, you did it with a camera. The museum is filled with copy negatives that we made ourselves from our own prints. So he did that as his hobby, and he was a surveyor, and that got him into different people's houses where he would have an opportunity to copy photographs that he came across.
So are those 35 millimeter negatives?
No, oftentimes, I don't know if you know Doug Lee, but Doug used to own the Heritage. He's a big photo collector and collects glass plates, any that you can buy on eBay and other. And he and Ed would often work together. As the negative came up, he would buy it, and then he would make a print for himself, and he would make a print for Ed. So these are oftentimes first generation prints from the original. Other times, if they just had a print, they would photograph it, probably 35 millimeter, and then print it from that. But everything that came to us from him was prints. This is the Spite House, and it still exists in Rockport. And it was moved from Phippsburg on this barge with strict instructions not to crack the plaster or any of the chimneys, and they managed to do that. There's a big long tale of why it's called the Spite House. Save that one for another day. Jeff Daworski is a lobsterman down in Stonington, and as a early 20-something, he ended up down there working as a sternman on a lobster boat and saw what was beginning to happen in Stonington, the gentrification and people from coming in and buying up the waterfront homes. and just how this old fishing town was changing and modernizing. And he made a conscious effort to start documenting it. And he had a Leica and took slides, 35mm slides, primarily 70s and 80s. So another whole look, really good eye. He's still alive. He lives on an island right off of Stonington. Quite a character. The subject of this photo is Ralph Stanley, who also just passed away within the last year. He lived out in Southwest Harbor and was a boat builder and a Maine icon and legend, and a fiddle player and a fiddle maker, and a longtime board member for the museum. Peggy Mckenna was a photographer who lived in Montville and photographed for the Waldo Independent. She died in, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago, and her collection came to the museum, and a lot of it is her newspaper work, but also her personal projects. And we have a lot of photos of Ralph in this collection. It's a massive collection, probably 200,000 images in and of itself. But that's typical of a 35mm photographer versus the old days when they would shoot 1 or 2 photos in a day. She might shoot 10 rolls in a day. So we'll wrap up the show by looking at some of Eastern Illustrating's work in Blue Hill. And as I mentioned, this was the collection that brought me to the museum and got me really interested in historic photography. Eastern Illustrating was a postcard company that was based in Belfast. The owner or the founder is Rudolf Hermann Cassens. He was from Rockland. His parents were German immigrants, and he supposedly had the German work ethic. And you can tell by his sign, he picked a really good time to start a postcard company in 1909. And he had a plan to photograph not just Belfast or not just Waldo County or not just Maine, but the entire United States and make real photo postcards. And his angle was the small towns in between. So he did not photograph Portland or Augusta or Bangor. There were other postcard companies that were there and doing that. He went to all the little villages and rural communities and photographed there, and that was his market. And by taking photographs and making real photo postcards, meaning they are actually printed from the negative, you could make small runs. The bigger companies did most of their printing in Germany, and you would have to get 1,000 or 2,000 of an image. Well, if you're a general store in Freedom, and you want to have 5 postcards to offer, you want 25 of each of them. You don't want 2,000 of each of them. And so from 1909 until 1947, Herman ran this business. And in their peak years, which were in the teens and the 20s, they were producing more than 1 million postcards, real photo postcards a season. And it was a season because they were only doing it in essentially the summer and the fall. The factory, these are all the people that worked in the factory, and you can see it was manned by women, mostly. And eventually he sold the company, and it changed hands several times, began making color photography, postcards. And then ultimately they sold out to Down East Magazine, who wanted to have a postcard line and access to the old negatives, but that never materialized, and they donated the whole archive of glass negatives to the Maine Photo Workshops, which is where I ended up encountering them. Since that collection has come to the museum, we've been able to actually grow it because a lot of the negatives that had escaped over the decades have been able to find them and raise the money to buy them back. So I started out with 35,000 negatives. We're up to over 50,000 now. I don't know where it ends. Part of the fun, also part of the frustration. But a couple of milestones in this whole process was I got to do a book with Maine State historian Earl Shuttleworth and Bill Bunting. And if you know Bill Bunting's books, A Day's Work and A Day's Work Too. I mean, I was with my 2 history heroes. This came out in 2016, and it's just about to be reprinted. And then a filmmaker down in Wiscasset named Sumner McCain did a documentary on the collection that has aired the past couple winters on MTVN called The Northeast by Eastern. And it's the first movie that I have a starring role in. Might be the only one. So we're only going to look at some of the Blue Hill images. There are, I believe, 186 altogether in Eastern's collection. The Blue Hill house still exists?
It's Blue Hill Inn now.
It's still in. Wow.
It looks like a dirt road there.
Oh, wow.
It was just so.
So he was probably brand new when this was photographed. One little tidbit that's interesting is the captions were written directly on the glass plate on the emulsion side by the young girls that worked in the postcard factory. They wrote in black washable ink, and they had to write backwards because they're writing on a negative, which would be reversed. And they were very good at it. Occasionally you'll see an R or an S backwards. Those letters are very hard, I guess. Never a backwards T or a backwards I though. We have multiple images of the George Stevens Academy. This is the earliest one. A little dark in the foreground, but there's a young boy sitting under this tree, and then there's a couple others on the front deck of the school. Now, Eastern did not date their photos purposely. They wanted photos because things changed relatively slowly. A postcard could stick around for a decade or more. But the numbers that they used in their titling are a little bit of a giveaway. And when I have a good example, I'll explain it. This is just a coastal schooner in the Narrows at Blue Hill. This would be a fairly early photo of the clubhouse on the golf course. The interesting story I had learned from Brad Emerson about how the golf course came to be, and I guess this building was just somewhat recently replaced in, let's say, 2008. But the clubhouse, after being built in 1915, was replaced. Now this is different than the Blue Hill house, which is now the Blue Hill Inn.
Right.
This one, did this still exist?
No.
Burned down in 30 something.
Oh, it did. I didn't really include any photos of the cottages, but they are very well represented in this collection, the cottages around Blue Hill. Except for one. This is the birthplace of Mary Ellen Chase. Did she only live there as a young girl? Do we know? Her gardens. This image has me very curious as to what they were mining in Blue Hill. Was it silver? Anyone know? Copper.
Well, there were a lot of, in 1881, the Atlas, there's just 1 million silver mines as well.
Really?
On the Atlas, it says such and such silver mine, and it's peppered all over Blue Hill. I don't know that that's what this was, but copper mine was over. I don't think you see that behind it.
Okay. This is an interesting example of postcards back then aren't not the same as what we think of as postcards now. I mean, you would not typically take a picture of a kind of a construction site or a mine. But photography was still new enough, and people were curious and also wanted to show off what their town looked like to their friends and relatives from away. Nice view of downtown. Elm trees. And so I didn't include a photo of the villa, but this is Mrs. Ethelbert Nevin's garden. It's the Cupid and Mercury in there. And her house, which is still there, is an Italian villa style. Beautiful though. think this scene could be taken today. Things growing back too much to allow that to happen.
Too many trees.
Too many trees. Another harbor view. And as I said, we would see Charles again, and here he is in the flesh, standing out in front of his forge. This would probably have been taken in the 1940s. And by the 40s, Eastern had switched over to flexible film, but we're still using large format, and again, 5x7 size, which is also interesting because the postcards they made were 3.5 by 5, so every image is actually cropped by a third. People are often surprised that collected postcards and then get to see the full negative.
Do you have any photos of the mills that are on some of the creeks and streams? The old mills?
In the collection, yes. I don't recall that in the Blue Hill group, though. There's a photo that I did not include of the pottery studio. There's the same name, I believe, as this. In other towns, we definitely have many mill photos, but it seems that by the time Eastern was doing their thing, Blue Hill had lost some of its industrialness and already. And so the Jonathan Fisher House has a camera obscura, which I was very envious of, and ended up building one of our own. And if you come to the museum, we have, it looks like a giant camera, but you can go inside of it and let your eyes adjust, and soon enough you will see what's outside projected on the back wall of it, upside down and backwards, just like a view camera would show you. Couple of East Blue Hill. Don't see. This will work a little bit. So their captioning was where it was, and then they would have a number. And people often think that the number has something to do with the date, but it doesn't. If you look on the side, you'll see 64 backwards scratched on the edge. When the photographer was getting ready to go out to photograph for the day, he would take his unexposed glass plates and write a number series in pencil on the edge of all of them, and then load them in his film holders and go out shooting. And on a piece of paper, he would have each time he took a photograph, next to that number, he would write what it was. And then he would ship that paper and all the exposed negatives back to Belfast. The girls would process them, match the number on the side of the plate to the number on the paper, and then be able to write a caption on the plate.
So that's a tide mill, that little building.
This is the tidal mill.
Yeah, that was a shingle mill.
We do have a photo of the mill.
There you go.
Ask and you shall receive. The landing in South Blue Hill. Is that the Stephen Tabor? That would be too much of a coincidence. Central Hall. Sardine factory. And here we see another view of the Eastern Steamship Line building, and I'm not sure which steamer that is. The dock is bustling, cars driven out on it, and then there's a two-master that's also tied up there.
They're using a camp, but where's the third one?
Wow.
Very much. Does anyone have any questions? I invite you all to come down and see us, and if it's during the week, you can come into the photo archives and see what we do. And typically I will have several volunteers either digitizing or cataloging, and that's how so much of our work gets done. But keep in touch. Thanks for showing up tonight and enjoy the rest of your summers.
Thank you.